For 60 years, a company on 6th Avenue in New York sold Americans something no big box store would ever stock: the parts to build their own electronics from scratch. Lafayette Radio Electronics put soldering irons, vacuum tubes, and 150-page catalogs into the hands of a generation that believed understanding how a radio worked was part of being a citizen. So how did a company with 300 retail locations and a catalog that doubled as a technical manual end up bankrupt, gutted, and forgotten inside a single decade? Lafayette's obsession with the technically literate customer would become the exact thing the American retail market punished. In the early 1920s, though, it was just common sense. Abraham Pletman opened wholesale radio service in New York City during the first radio craze. Broadcasting was so new that most listeners built their own receivers from parts. These included crystal sets, vacuum tube circuits, galena detectors, and rheostats for controlling filament voltage. All of it had to be assembled by hand because the consumer electronics industry as we know it did not exist yet. Every broadcast station in the country shared a single frequency, 833 kilohertz, and signal interference was constant. In that world, the customer was not a shopper. The customer was an engineer. Pletman's shop stocked the components, and the people who walked through the door did the rest. By 1931, the company had launched its own brand of radio receivers under the Lafayette trademark. 4 years later, the Federal Trade Commission forced a reckoning. The commission ruled that calling itself wholesale radio service while selling directly to the public was misleading, and the organization restructured as Radio Wire Television Incorporated. In 1948, a brief catalog partnership with Chicago-based Concord Radio followed. The two companies billed themselves as the world's largest radio supply organization, with operations running out of New York and Chicago simultaneously. By 1952, the partnership had dissolved, and the brand consolidated under the name that would define it for 3 decades: Lafayette Radio Electronics. The post-war years were the company's golden age, and the reason is straightforward. World War II had trained an entire generation in electronics, radar, and communications. Returning veterans understood circuitry the way their grandchildren would later understand software. They wanted parts, kits, and specifications. Lafayette gave them exactly that. The Lafayette catalog became something close to a secular Bible for the American hobbyist. These were not glossy lifestyle brochures. They ran over 150 pages, packed with schematics, transistor specifications, and detailed technical descriptions of every component in stock. The product mix was deliberately hybrid. Proprietary Lafayette and Criterion branded components sat alongside high-end equipment from Pioneer, Marantz, Fisher, and JBL. You could buy a budget Lafayette amplifier on one page and a reference-grade JBL speaker system on the next. If you were the kind of person who cared about impedance ratings and frequency response curves, this catalog was written for you. Notable proprietary products included the HE90 CB radio and the FS91 transistor radio, which was widely regarded as one of the finest portable sets of its era, both technically and aesthetically. The retail footprint matched the catalog's ambition. Lafayette operated company-owned stores with dedicated sound rooms for demonstrating high-fidelity systems, and it ran an associate store program that let independent entrepreneurs open branded outlets with their own capital. In 1965, the investment to open an associate location ran between $10,000 and $30,000, and the network covered 148 stores across 42 states and Puerto Rico. By 1972, the total retail footprint had grown to 313 locations. A decade later, the required associate investment had climbed to between $40,000 and $75,000. Lafayette was a national presence, and the cost of entry reflected it. This decision to serve the dedicated expert seemed like solid footing. It was not. Two catastrophes hit Lafayette in the mid-1970s, and neither one alone would have been survivable. The first was Citizens Band Radio. After the 1973 oil embargo and the federal 55-mile-per-hour speed limit, CB radio use exploded across American highways. Truckers and commuters used the technology to share information about fuel availability and the location of speed enforcement officers. Lafayette invested heavily, becoming a primary supplier for the CB boom. Then, in 1977, the Federal Communications Commission expanded the CB spectrum from 23 channels to 40. Overnight, every 23-channel transceiver sitting in Lafayette's warehouses became functionally obsolete in the eyes of every buyer in America. The company had signed firm, non-cancelable purchase commitments for thousands of these units. They liquidated the inventory at devastating losses, with some units moving for less than $40, well below what Lafayette had paid to acquire them. The financial damage ran into the millions. And if that were the only crisis, Lafayette's management might have found a path through. They did not get that chance. At the same time, the company had bet heavily on quadraphonic sound, a 4-channel audio format that the industry believed would replace stereo. Lafayette's receivers were among the first to incorporate advanced SQ matrix circuitry. The problem was not a lack of consumer interest. The problem was that 3 competing and incompatible formats, SQ, QS, and CD4, confused buyers so thoroughly that they stopped purchasing quadraphonic hardware altogether. By 1976, the format was dead. Lafayette had millions more in unsold inventory, and no market left to absorb it. While these internal crises burned through the company's cash reserves, the external retail environment was turning hostile from 2 directions at once. Radio Shack, backed by Tandy Corporation's capital, had expanded to thousands of locations nationwide by the late 1970s. A Radio Shack outlet was never more than a few miles from any American household. Lafayette, with roughly 125 company-owned stores, could not compete on sheer access. Worse, Radio Shack had pivoted away from the hobbyist entirely. It now sold batteries, cables, and pre-assembled consumer electronics to people who had no interest in building anything themselves. The average American customer had changed, and Radio Shack changed with them. Lafayette did not. In the New York metropolitan area, Lafayette's home territory, a new generation of high-volume electronics discounters made the situation even more dire. Crazy Eddie, The Wiz, PC Richard and Son, and Newmark and Lewis used aggressive television advertising and loss leader pricing to dominate the consumer electronics market. Lafayette's management had historically prioritized high gross profit margins and rapid inventory turnover, a strategy that frequently left popular items out of stock at the exact moment competitors were practically giving them away. The customer who once drove past 3 stores to reach a Lafayette because the staff understood electronics now had a Crazy Eddie 2 blocks closer, selling the same Pioneer receiver for $30 less. On January 4, 1980, Lafayette Radio Electronics filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in the Eastern District of New York. Within 48 hours, roughly 60 of the company's 125 stores were shuttered. Employees were given minimal notice to box all current inventory for return to the central warehouse in Syosset, Long Island. Non-inventoried fixtures and older stock were discarded on the spot. The speed of the collapse told the whole story. In 1981, the Ward's Company of Richmond, Virginia, purchased Lafayette's remaining assets for several $million. Ward's, which would later become Circuit City, wanted two things: entry into the New York market and the tax credits attached to Lafayette's accumulated losses. The surviving stores reopened under a hybrid name, Lafayette Circuit City. The experiment failed almost immediately. Lafayette's storefronts were far too small for the superstore format Ward's was building nationally. They lacked the floor space for major appliances, which were a core revenue driver for the chain. A no-haggling advertising campaign featuring Don King failed to connect with New York shoppers accustomed to the deal-making chaos of competitors like Crazy Eddie. Ward's reportedly spent $20 million trying to make the New York market work. By 1986, every Lafayette Circuit City location was closed. The Syosset Distribution Center stayed open one final year to honor outstanding warranty obligations, and then it went dark. If you grew up in a house where a Lafayette catalog sat next to the soldering station on the workbench, you already know what disappeared when those stores closed. It was not just a retailer, it was a commercial ecosystem built on a specific assumption about the American customer, that this person was an engineer, not a passive consumer. Lafayette stocked the parts, printed the schematics, and trusted that the person reading page 47 actually wanted to understand what a crossover network did before buying one. The retail model that replaced it made no such assumption. It sold sealed boxes, extended warranties, and the implicit promise that you would never need to open the case. That shift was not just commercial, it was cultural. An entire generation of Americans learned basic electronics, signal theory, and mechanical reasoning not in a classroom, but from a catalog and a kit ordered through the mail. When Lafayette and the ecosystem it represented disappeared, that pipeline disappeared with it. Nothing replaced it at the same scale. The hands-on knowledge that once sat in suburban garages and basement workshops across the country did not transfer to the next generation, because the institutions that delivered it were gone. Lafayette and Criterion components still surface at swap meets and in vintage audio forums, sought after by collectors who recognize the build quality decades later. The catalogs themselves sell for real money online. The brand name, though, belongs to no one now. It exists only in the memory of a generation that learned to solder before they learned to drive, and in a country that decided somewhere along the way that knowing how things worked was no longer the point.